"We're losing her. Get the crash team on standby now." The words were barely louder than a breath, but they cut through the sterile air like a crack in glass. And in that moment, time did something strange. It slowed, stretched, and refused to move forward as Ethan Whitmore stood frozen just outside the delivery room, his hand still resting on the cold steel handle he had been about to push open. 6 hours earlier, everything had been perfect, engineered to precision the way he built his empire, every detail accounted for, every variable controlled, because that was who Ethan Whitmore was, a man who didn't leave outcomes to chance. The Whitmore Medical Pavilion rose 43 stories above Manhattan, its glass exterior reflecting the city lights like a monument to power. And tonight, the entire top floor had been reserved under his name, a private suite designed for discretion, comfort, and absolute control, the kind of place where problems didn't exist because men like him paid to make sure they never did. Ava Carter had laughed softly when she first saw the room, her dark eyes tracing the soft gold lighting, the quiet hum of machines, the view of the Hudson stretching endlessly beyond the windows, and she had squeezed his hand with a gentleness that never quite matched the world he lived in, whispering that it felt too much, that a simple room would have been enough, that bringing a life into the world didn't need marble floors and concierge service. But Ethan had only smiled, brushing his thumb across her knuckles, telling her that she deserved the best, that their child deserved the best, because in his world, love was proven through provision, through protection, through eliminating risk. The nurses had moved with calm efficiency, their voices measured, their steps quiet, everything unfolding exactly as expected, the steady rhythm of the monitor echoing like a metronome of certainty, each beep a promise that things were under control. And for a while, Ethan believed it, standing at her side, watching the rise and fall of her breath, memorizing the way her strength showed not in noise but in stillness, in the way her fingers curled tightly around his. Without a single complaint, her silence louder than any fear he refused to acknowledge. But then something shifted, subtle at first, almost invisible, a hesitation in the rhythm, a glance exchanged between two nurses that lasted half a second too long, a doctor stepping in with a tone that was just slightly too careful, and Ethan felt it before he understood it. That quiet fracture beneath the surface of perfection, the moment when control begins to slip and no amount of money can hold it in place. "Is everything okay?" he had asked, his voice steady out of habit, not truth, and the doctor had given him a practice smile, the kind designed to calm, not to reveal, saying they were just monitoring a small irregularity, nothing to worry about, just precaution, always precaution. But Ethan Whitmore didn't build billion-dollar companies by ignoring the difference between reassurance and reality. And something in that room had changed. Ava had turned her head slightly, her voice soft but clear, telling him to stay with her, not to leave. And he had nodded, because leaving had never been an option, not for this, not for her. But even as he stood there, even as he told himself that everything was under control, the monitor betrayed him, its rhythm no longer steady, its sound no longer certain. And somewhere behind him, just beyond the door, a voice dropped low, urgent, almost hidden, as if saying it too loudly would make it real. "Call 911. Quickly." And for the first time in his life, Ethan Whitmore realized that there were moments no contract could secure, no fortune could fix, and no power could command back into place. Moments where the only thing left was to stand still and watch as everything you thought you controlled slipped quietly beyond your reach. The word echoed in Ethan Whitmore's mind long after it was spoken, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, controlled, and that was what made it dangerous, because men like him understood that true emergencies did not announce themselves with chaos. They arrived quietly, wrapped in calm voices and steady hands, and by the time you recognized them, it was already too late to pretend everything was fine. He did not move. At first, his fingers tightening slightly against the metal handle as if pressure alone could anchor him back into the version of reality he had designed, the one where outcomes followed planning and risk was something calculated, minimized, eliminated. But the sound of the monitor inside the room shifted again, a fraction faster, uneven, like a rhythm searching for stability and failing to find it. And that was when he pushed the door open. The light inside felt brighter than before, sharper, as if the room itself had changed its mind. and the team that had once moved with quiet confidence now carried an urgency they could not fully hide. Their movements still controlled but no longer effortless. A nurse adjusting equipment with hands that moved just a little too quickly. Another checking the monitor twice instead of once. And at the center of it all, Ava lay still, her head turned slightly toward him, her eyes finding his. The moment he stepped in, steady, searching, asking a question she did not speak aloud. Ethan crossed the room in 3 steps, taking her hand again, grounding himself in the warmth of her skin, the only thing in that space that still felt real, and he told her, with a certainty he did not feel, that everything was going to be okay, that they were exactly where they needed to be, that the best doctors in the country were right here, because that was the truth he had built his life on, that resources created safety, that preparation guaranteed outcomes. But as he spoke, the doctor, at the foot of the bed, exchanged another glance with a colleague, and this time it did not go unnoticed. "What is happening?" Ethan asked, his voice low, controlled, the same tone he used in boardrooms when something did not add up, and the doctor stepped forward, choosing words carefully, explaining that there was a complication, rare but manageable, that they needed to act quickly to stabilize both mother and baby, that everything was under control, always under control. But Ethan had spent his life reading between the lines, and what was not being said carried more weight than what was. Ava's fingers tightened slightly around his, not in panic, but in presence, and she drew in a slow breath, her voice soft yet unwavering as she spoke his name, asking him to listen, really listen. And for the first time since the night began, Ethan stopped trying to fix the moment and simply stood in it, hearing the change in the room, feeling the shift in the air, recognizing that this was not a problem to solve, but a reality to face. The monitor sounded again, steady for a second, then uncertain, and a nurse adjusted something at the side, her expression composed but focused, and the doctor gave a quiet instruction that carried more weight than volume, the kind of instruction that changed outcomes, and Ethan felt something inside him loosen, not break, but release, the illusion that he could control this, that he could negotiate with it, that he could outthink it, because none of those things mattered here. "Stay with me," Ava whispered, her voice calm, stronger than the situation allowed, and he nodded immediately, not because it was expected, but because it was the only thing he could promise. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Whitmore did not think about strategy or solutions or consequences. He thought only about the woman in front of him and the life they were about to meet, and the fragile space between those two things. A space that no amount of power could protect, only endure. The room did not grow louder, but it grew heavier, as if every second carried more weight than the one before, pressing down on the air, on the machines, on the steady control Ethan Whitmore had built his entire life around. And he could feel it slipping in quiet increments he could not stop. The doctor spoke again, this time closer, his voice calm but firmer, explaining that they needed to move Ava to a different unit within the floor, one equipped for rapid response, a place designed for moments like this, though the phrase itself felt carefully chosen, softened, as if language could protect them from reality, and Ethan nodded automatically, because agreeing was easier than asking questions he was not ready to hear answered. Ava's hand remained in his, her grip steady despite everything, and when she looked at him, there was no panic in her expression, only a clarity that made his chest tighten, as if she had already stepped into a truth he was still trying to avoid. "It is going to be okay," he said again, quieter now, not to convince her, but to hold on to something familiar, something structured, and she gave the smallest smile, not because she believed it, but because she understood him, because she always had. The team moved with precision, adjusting lines, checking readings, preparing the transfer with a coordination that came from training, not ease, and as the bed began to shift, rolling smoothly across the polished floor, Ethan walked beside it, never letting go, his presence the only thing he could still offer without condition. The hallway outside stretched long and immaculate, the soft lighting casting a calm that no longer matched the urgency moving through it. And for a brief moment, everything felt unreal, like a scene unfolding behind glass, silent except for the rhythmic sound that followed them. That monitor, that fragile, uncertain beat that refused to settle into something dependable. A nurse walked slightly ahead, speaking into a device clipped at her collar, her words measured but urgent, calling for additional support, and Ethan caught fragments, terms he recognized but could not fully assemble into meaning. And that was when he realized that knowledge did not equal control, not here, not now. They entered another room, larger, brighter, filled with equipment that seemed both advanced and impersonal. And the doctor gave a series of instructions, each one clear, each one immediate. And the space responded, people moving into position, hands steady, voices low, the kind of quiet coordination that spoke of experience. But beneath it all, there was still that undercurrent, that thin line between stability and something else, something unknown. Ava's breathing changed slightly, not in distress, but in focus, as if she was gathering strength rather than losing it. And she turned her head again, her voice softer now, but no less certain as she spoke his name, asking him to promise something, not about the outcome, not about the future, but about presence, about staying, about not letting fear make him disappear into the version of himself that solved problems instead of feeling them. Ethan leaned closer, his forehead nearly touching hers, and he told her he was not going anywhere, not now, not ever. The words simple, stripped of everything else he had relied on for years, and for the first time, they felt real in a way his certainty never had. The doctor glanced at the monitor again, then at the team, and gave a subtle nod that shifted the room into its next phase. A transition so smooth it almost went unnoticed, but Ethan saw it, felt it, the moment when waiting ended and action began, and in that moment, he understood something he had never allowed himself to consider before, that control was never about preventing what could happen. It was about how you stood when it did. The monitor sounded again, uneven but present, a fragile rhythm fighting to remain, and Ethan tightened his hold on Ava's hand, not to steady her, but to steady himself, because for the first time in his life, there was nothing left to manage, nothing left to negotiate, only a single, undeniable truth unfolding in front of him, and all he could do was stay and witness it. The shift was almost invisible, but it changed everything. The moment when preparation turned into decision, and every movement in the room began to carry intention instead of routine, and Ethan Whitmore felt it like a quiet current beneath his feet, steady but undeniable, pulling them all forward whether he was ready or not. The doctor's voice lowered as he spoke to the team, each instruction measured, precise, and followed without hesitation, a choreography built for moments where time no longer stretched but narrowed, focusing everything into what mattered most. And Ethan stood just beside Ava's shoulder, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence, far enough to realize how little of this he could control. The monitor continued its uneven rhythm, not failing, not stable, existing somewhere in between, and that fragile balance seemed to define the entire room, a space suspended between what was and what might be. Ava's eyes closed briefly, not in surrender, but in gathering, her breath slow, deliberate, as if she was aligning herself with something deeper than fear. And when she opened them again, she looked directly at Ethan, not searching, not questioning, but grounding him in a way no words ever could. "Listen to me," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tension surrounding them. And he leaned closer without thinking, as if proximity could make him understand something he had spent his entire life avoiding. "Whatever happens, you do not try to control it. You stay." The words settled into him with a weight that felt unfamiliar, because staying, truly staying, without fixing, without solving, without commanding, was not something he had ever been taught how to do. He nodded anyway, because in this moment, her voice carried more truth than anything else in the room. Across from them, a nurse adjusted the settings on a machine, her focus unwavering, while another checked Ava's vitals with a calm that came from experience, not certainty, and the doctor stepped closer again, his expression composed but no longer distant, explaining that they were approaching a critical window, that decisions would need to be made quickly, that they would guide the process but could not predict every response. And Ethan heard every word, understood every implication, and still found himself unable to apply any of it, because this was not a negotiation, not a strategy session, not a situation where influence changed outcomes. This was something else entirely. Ava's hand tightened again, a small movement, intentional, reminding him that she was still here, still present, still choosing to move forward despite everything. And he realized then that strength did not always look like action. Sometimes it looked like stillness, like trust, like the quiet decision to continue even when certainty was gone. The room seemed to narrow around them, the edges fading as focus sharpened on the center, on Ava, on the life they were about to meet, on the space between them that held both fear and hope in equal measure. And Ethan felt something inside him shift, not breaking, but opening, as if the version of himself built on control was making room for something he had never allowed before. The monitors sounded again, a little steadier this time, not perfect, but present, and the doctor gave a subtle nod, acknowledging the change without celebrating it, because in moments like this, nothing was certain until it was finished. Ethan lowered his head slightly, his voice quiet as he spoke to Ava. Not promises, not reassurances, just presence, just truth, telling her he was here, that he would not move, that whatever came next, they would face it together, not as a plan, not as a strategy, but as something real, something unmeasured, something that could not be bought or controlled, only lived through, one breath at a time. Time no longer moved in minutes. It moved in moments, measured by breath, by sound, by the subtle rise and fall of a rhythm that refused to fully settle, and Ethan Whitmore found himself watching the monitor as if it held the answer to everything he could not control, every uneven pulse echoing deeper than it should, each pause stretching just long enough to make him question what came next. The room remained composed, the team focused, but the tension had shifted into something sharper, more defined, no longer hidden beneath calm professionalism, but present in the precision of every action, in the way the doctor's voice carried a quiet urgency that did not need to be raised to be understood. "We are close," the doctor said, not as reassurance, but as a statement of reality, and Ethan felt those words settle differently, not as something to hold on to, but as something to face. Ava's breathing grew more deliberate, each inhale measured, each exhale controlled, her strength unfolding not in resistance, but in acceptance of what her body was doing, what it was meant to do. And there was something in that quiet resilience that made Ethan realize how little he had ever truly understood about strength. He had built power through control, through influence, through outcomes he could predict and shape. But this was something entirely different, something that did not bend to will or negotiation, something that required presence instead of command. Ava turned her head slightly again, her voice softer now, but still unwavering as she spoke his name, and there was a calm in her tone that did not match the intensity of the moment, as if she had stepped beyond fear into something clearer, something grounded, and when their eyes met, he saw it, not certainty, but trust, not in the situation, but in him, in his ability to stay, to remain, to not disappear into the instinct that had defined him for so long. "Do not look away," she whispered, and he understood immediately, not just the words, but the meaning behind them, the request to be present in a way that could not be replaced, could not be delegated, could not be solved by anyone else. Around them, the team moved in tighter coordination, the space narrowing further as focus sharpened, each instruction followed instantly, each adjustment made with care, and the monitor responded, not perfectly, but with a rhythm that held, that resisted the uncertainty that had defined the past moments. And for the first time since the shift began, there was a subtle change in the air, not relief, not yet, but something closer to possibility. Ethan leaned closer, his voice quiet as he spoke to her. Not promises, not assurances, just presence, repeating that he was here, that he was not going anywhere, that he saw her, truly saw her, not as someone to protect, not as someone to fix, but as someone who was carrying them both through something he could not. The doctor gave another instruction, steady, focused, and the room responded as one, and Ethan realized that this was the moment, not defined by outcome, but by choice, by Ava's decision to continue, to trust, to move forward even without certainty, and something inside him shifted again, deeper this time, breaking through the final layer of control he had held onto, leaving behind something quieter, something more honest. The monitors sounded again, stronger now, not perfect, but steady enough to hold, and the doctor's expression changed just slightly, a fraction of relief passing through before discipline returned, because nothing was finished yet, nothing was guaranteed, but the direction had changed. Ethan tightened his hold on Ava's hand, not out of fear, but out of connection, grounding himself in the only truth that mattered in that moment. That he was here, that she was here, that the life they were about to meet was still fighting to arrive. And for the first time in his life, that was enough, not because it was certain, but because it was real. The room did not erupt into celebration, but something shifted in a way that everyone felt without needing to say it. A quiet turning point where uncertainty loosened its grip just enough to let possibility breathe. And Ethan Whitmore noticed it not in words, but in the way the doctor's shoulders lowered a fraction, in the way a nurse allowed herself a single slower breath before returning to focus, in the way the monitor held its rhythm just long enough to be trusted for one more second. Ava remained steady, her strength no longer something he observed from the outside, but something he felt connected to, as if her calm had become the anchor he did not know he needed. And when she looked at him again, there was a softness there now, not because the moment had passed, but because she had accepted it fully, without resistance, without fear defining her. "Stay with me," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper, and Ethan nodded again, not out of obligation, but because the words had become something sacred, a promise stripped of complexity, a commitment that did not require strategy or control, only presence. The doctor stepped closer once more, his voice clear, focused, explaining that they were entering the final stage, that everything they had worked to stabilize was now aligning, that they needed one more coordinated effort, and Ethan listened, not trying to decode outcomes, not searching for guarantees, but simply absorbing the moment as it unfolded, trusting the people around him in a way that felt unfamiliar, yet necessary. The team responded instantly, their movements precise, synchronized, each action supporting the next, and the room seemed to narrow even further, all attention centered on Ava, on the life she carried, on the fragile balance that had brought them to this exact point in time. The monitor sounded again, steadier now, not perfect, but strong enough to hold, and Ethan felt something inside him shift once more, not a release this time, but a quiet rebuilding, a new understanding forming where control had once lived, something rooted not in certainty, but in trust, in presence, in the realization that not everything needed to be commanded to be meaningful. Ava drew in another slow breath, her focus unwavering, and he could see the effort in her, not as strain, but as determination, a choice made again and again in each second, and he realized that this was what real strength looked like, not power over a situation, but commitment within it. "You are doing this," he said softly, his voice steady now, not because he knew the outcome, but because he believed in her, and she gave the faintest nod, her eyes never leaving his, holding on to that connection as everything around them moved with increasing urgency. The doctor gave another instruction, firm and immediate, and the team responded without hesitation, the room moving as one, every action aligned toward a single purpose, and Ethan felt the weight of the moment settle fully, not as fear, but as clarity, as truth. The monitor continued, each sound now more consistent, more assured, and the doctor's expression shifted again, this time unmistakable, a quiet confidence breaking through the discipline, and Ethan recognized it instantly, not as a guarantee, but as a sign, a direction, a movement towards something better than what had been moments before. Ava's hand tightened once more, a final grounding, and Ethan leaned closer, his voice barely a breath as he spoke, telling her he was here, that she was not alone, that whatever came next, they had reached this point together, and that was something no uncertainty could take away. And then, in that suspended space between effort and outcome, between fear and hope, everything held, not perfectly, not permanently, but enough for the next moment to arrive, enough for something new to begin. The moment did not announce itself with noise or sudden change. It arrived quietly, almost gently, like a breath finally finding its rhythm after hesitation. And Ethan Whitmore felt it before he understood it, the shift from holding on to waiting, from waiting to becoming, as if the entire room had exhaled at the same time, without anyone realizing it. The monitor continued its steady sound, no longer uncertain, no longer searching, but holding, consistent enough to trust, and the doctor's voice carried a new tone, still focused, still controlled, but lighter in a way that did not need explanation. "We are there," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a certainty that settled into the space like quiet sunlight breaking through clouds. Ava's eyes remained on Ethan, her strength no longer something she was gathering, but something she had already become, and there was a calm in her expression that felt deeper than relief, something rooted in knowing she had crossed the hardest part without losing herself. Ethan stayed exactly where he had promised he would, his hand still wrapped around hers, his presence no longer driven by fear or urgency, but by something steadier, something grounded, as if the storm he had felt inside him had finally found its center. The team moved with renewed precision, not rushed, not tense, but purposeful, each action aligning toward completion, and Ethan watched them not as someone trying to understand or control, but as someone witnessing something he would remember for the rest of his life. Ava drew in one more slow breath, her fingers tightening just slightly, and then easing, and in that space between effort and release, something changed, something quiet and undeniable, a transition that did not need to be explained because it could be felt in every corner of the room. The doctor's expression softened, the smallest shift, but enough to signal that the direction they had fought toward was now real, no longer fragile, no longer uncertain, and Ethan felt something inside him give way, not in weakness, but in recognition, in acceptance, in a realization that this moment, this exact moment, was not something to manage or control, but something to receive. A sound followed, not loud, not dramatic, but new, unmistakably new, a presence entering the room in a way that changed everything without needing to be announced, and Ethan's breath caught for a second, not from fear, but from something deeper, something he had never allowed himself to feel so fully before. Ava's eyes closed briefly, then opened again, softer now, the tension gone, replaced by something warm, something whole, and when she looked at him, there was no question left, no uncertainty, only a quiet understanding that they had reached the other side of something they could never fully explain. The doctor spoke again, this time with clarity that needed no interpretation, confirming what the room already knew, what Ethan had already felt, and the team responded with a calm that came from completion, not anticipation. Ethan leaned closer, his voice low as he spoke her name, not because she needed reassurance, but because he needed to say it, needed to anchor himself in the reality that she was here, that they were here, that everything they had just lived through had brought them to this moment, and for the first time in his life, he did not think about what came next, did not plan, did not calculate, did not try to shape the future into something predictable. He simply stayed, exactly where he was, exactly where he had promised to be, and allowed himself to feel it, fully, completely, the quiet, overwhelming truth that some moments do not belong to power or control, they belong to presence, to connection, to the fragile, beautiful act of something new beginning. The room did not return to what it had been before, because moments like this do not allow for returning. They transform everything quietly, permanently, and Ethan Whitmore stood there, still holding Ava's hand, realizing that the silence now felt different, no longer heavy with uncertainty, but filled with something softer, something that did not need to prove itself to be real. The doctor's voice carried a calm assurance as he spoke to the team, confirming stability, guiding the final steps with a precision that no longer felt urgent but intentional, and the nurses moved with a quiet ease that only came when the hardest part had passed, their focus still sharp, but no longer burdened by tension. Ava's breathing slowed, her body settling into a rhythm that matched the calm surrounding her, and when she turned her head slightly toward Ethan, her eyes held a warmth that had not been there before, not because the moment had been easy, but because she had moved through it and come out whole on the other side. Ethan leaned closer, his hand still wrapped around hers, his presence no longer driven by the need to hold everything together, but by something simpler, something truer, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel without measuring it, without trying to define it, without needing it to make sense. A nurse stepped forward gently, her movements careful, respectful, and placed something small, something impossibly new, within Ava's reach, and the space seemed to pause again, not in tension, but in reverence, as if everyone in the room understood that this moment belonged not to procedure, not to medicine, but to something far more human. Ava's expression softened in a way Ethan had never seen before, her strength shifting into something tender, something open, and when she looked down, her entire presence changed, as if the world had narrowed into a single, undeniable truth resting in front of her. Ethan followed her gaze, slowly, almost cautiously, as if moving too quickly might break something fragile. And when he saw it, truly saw it, everything else fell away, the room, the machines, the structure he had relied on his entire life, all of it fading into something distant and unimportant. He did not speak at first, because there were no words that could hold what he was feeling, no language that could capture the shift happening inside him, the quiet unraveling of everything he thought mattered, replaced by something he had never built, never controlled, never anticipated. Ava reached for him again, her fingers brushing against his, guiding him closer, not as a request, but as an invitation, and he stepped forward without hesitation, drawn into a moment that required nothing from him except presence, except honesty. "She is here," Ava whispered, her voice filled with something deeper than relief, something grounded, something real, and Ethan nodded slowly, his throat tightening not from fear, but from recognition, from the realization that this was what everything had been leading to, not the control, not the power, not the ability to shape outcomes, but this quiet, undeniable beginning that could not be bought or engineered. The doctor stepped back slightly, giving space, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption, and the room adjusted around them, the focus shifting away from urgency and towards something softer, something that did not need to be directed. Ethan lowered his head just slightly, his voice barely audible as he spoke, not to explain, not to reassure, but simply to acknowledge what was in front of him, what was now real, what had changed him in a way he could never reverse. And in that quiet space, where the noise of the world had faded and only truth remained, Ethan Whitmore understood something for the first time in his life, that the greatest moments are not the ones you control, but the ones you finally learn to receive. The world did not rush back in all at once. It returned slowly, gently, as if careful not to disturb what had just been created, and Ethan Whitmore stood there, still and quiet, realizing that everything outside this room had lost its urgency, its weight, its illusion of importance, because nothing he had built, nothing he had controlled, had ever felt like this. Ava rested against the pillows, her strength no longer tested, but revealed, her presence calm in a way that carried both exhaustion and peace. And when she looked at him, there was something unspoken between them, a shared understanding that this moment had changed them both in ways that could not be undone. The room moved around them with quiet intention, nurses completing final checks, the doctor offering a few measured words about stability and recovery, but none of it interrupted what was happening at the center, because this was no longer about procedure, no longer about risk. It was about what remained after everything uncertain had passed. Ethan took a slow breath, deeper than any he had taken that night, and for the first time, it felt complete, not forced, not controlled, just natural, as if his body had finally caught up with what his heart had already accepted. He looked at Ava again, truly looked at her, and saw not just the woman he loved, but the strength he had underestimated, the quiet resilience that had carried them both through something he could never have managed on his own, and there was a humility in that realization that settled into him without resistance. "You did this," he said softly, his voice steady but filled with something new, something honest, and Ava gave a small, knowing smile, not because she needed the acknowledgement, but because she understood what it meant for him to say it. She shifted slightly, careful, intentional, and then looked down again, her gaze softening in a way that drew Ethan closer without words, and he followed, his steps slower now, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the moment, for the fragile, powerful truth resting between them. He reached out, not to take control, not to fix or guide, but simply to connect, his hand moving with a gentleness that did not belong to the man he had been before tonight. And when his fingers brushed against something so small, so new, something that existed entirely outside the world he understood, he felt it, the final shift, the quiet transformation that no one had witnessed but him. Ava watched him, her expression calm, Her eyes filled with a quiet warmth that reflected something back to him he had never seen before. Not power, not control, but presence, real and unguarded. And in that reflection, Ethan recognized himself in a way he never had. The doctor stepped in once more, offering a final confirmation that everything was stable, that both mother and child were safe. And Ethan nodded, not because he needed reassurance anymore, but because he understood what it meant, not as an outcome he had secured, but as a gift he had been allowed to receive. Ava's hand found his again, her grip light but certain, and he closed his fingers around hers, not out of necessity, but out of choice, because staying was no longer something he had to remind himself to do. It was something he had become. The room quieted further, the last movements settling into stillness, and Ethan lowered his head slightly, his voice soft as he spoke, not to promise anything, not to define the future, but simply to acknowledge what had changed, what had begun, what would never be the same again. And in that quiet, steady space, surrounded not by control but by truth, Ethan Whitmore understood something that would stay with him long after this night faded into memory, that the greatest power he would ever hold was not in what he could command, but in what he could choose to stay present for, and that sometimes the most important victories are the ones you never planned for, the ones that arrive quietly and change everything.